Right, hi, my name is Lee Morrison. I'm the founding instructor of Urban Combatives, and I'm going to present to you the first part of 3, possibly 4 parts of a lecture that relates to PSY-COM, or the psychology of combat or conflict. Basically the psychology of violence and the elements that are attached to that. So in this first part, we're going to look at, first of all, understanding fear, or our interpretation of fear, and also understanding the chemical cocktail of adrenaline, which is the natural biochemistry that hits your body during a potentially fight-to-arrest situation. We're also going to look at the characteristics of what's most likely to trigger that in a violent criminal sense. So I guess you could say that the topic of this first part of PSY-COM is going to relate to what Sun Tzu said as knowing yourself and knowing your enemy, or understanding yourself and understanding your enemy. So we're going to look towards understanding how you're going to feel in a biochemistry sense under the effects of adrenal stress when facing potential violence. So I'll start this with a question. What is the most or the least addressed element within the martial world of martial arts, self-protection, or anything like it? The most least addressed area. The answer lies within gaining an understanding of both the psychology of violent behavior and the effect that it will have on the recipient during the event. There are really 2 key areas of concern here. The first is emotional state management, and the second is emotional state access. To understand, first of all, what an emotional state is, it can be defined by your current mood and your physiology, so how you hold your body and how you feel about certain things. You could be in a happy state, an unhappy state, intrigue state, a state of curiosity, any number of things. But what we're talking about here are the emotional states that are most likely to be present throughout the entire spectrum of a violent event. Okay? So emotional state management would indicate controlling your feelings, controlling the emotional response. The control of any and all associated negative emotions that could relate to fight-to-arrest. So adrenaline, fear, anger, particularly red mist, loss of control, confusion, denial, disorientation, fatigue, pain. All of these elements will be present during a fight-to-arrest dynamic, rather than any simulated experience. They can be present during a heavily simulated experience as well, which induces an emotional response. But generally, in a sporting sense or in a training sense, when you're training any type of combative skill, then you're not likely to be in the emotional states that you would be in when you needed the said skill. So hence, we want to elaborate on that more. The next would relate to emotional state access. So what would be the best emotional states that I could access before, during, and after a potentially violent dynamic? Well, first of all, you would like pre-fight, a high level of awareness, along with threat cue recognition as a skill. So you could spot the problem, recognize it as the problem as early as possible. Next would be confidence in your ability to perform. Immediate access when necessary, when the fight part comes, as we'll see, of cold clinical aggression. The ability to switch back post-event, as soon as the threat is no longer ambulatory, to a calm and observant state. So this is an idea of what emotional state management would be, controlling emotions, and emotional state access, accessing the most productive emotions that would be useful to winning the event, or prevailing in the event. First, a little bit of understanding in the biochemistry sense. The threat detecting organ in the brain is called the amygdala, and it's about the size of an almond, and it sits in a pair behind the hypothalamus, behind the nose. The key response for this organ, the key attribute of this organ is it's considered the threat detecting organ in the brain. So when suddenly there is an alarm bell response created by the recognition of a potential threat in your immediate environment, this in turn will then trigger your heart rate escalation, which then triggers a load of effects afterwards. This in turn creates a knock-on of additional effects that we are in fact going to discuss in detail here. So understand what happens. You see a threat stimuli, the amygdala sends a signal to the brain that says danger, your heart rate is increased and a biochemistry cocktail is released to prepare you for flight or fight. This alarm also creates a neural surge which shuts down the parasympathetic nervous system. So understand what that is. Your parasympathetic nervous system is your natural state of homeostasis, feed and breed, where you are most comfortable, where everything is functioning in a physiological and emotional sense. Okay. Sudden stimuli of a threat, which triggers the amygdala and escalates the heart rate beyond a certain level, will then replace it with what's called the sympathetic nervous system, or the fight or flight response. When this happens, the cognitive brain shuts down and is replaced by the limbic system. So first of all, let me make you understand parasympathetic to sympathetic. Imagine the analogy of the electricity and lighting that it would take to light up a complete shopping complex, and everything is working vibrantly as it should. This would be you in parasympathetic nervous system. Then let's say there's a sudden stimuli or a shock to the system or something that indicates threat. Now you have a power shutdown, and then a generator will kick off sympathetic nervous system, just giving you the necessary energy you need before you get through this potentially dangerous situation. So what that means is, on a physical and physiological, psychological level, your performance under fight stress will be impaired because certain functions have now been shut down as you go from parasympathetic to sympathetic. This rapidly impairs your ability to make decisions under stress, placing you in what's referred to as the midbrain state, or the reptile brain state. The limbic brain acts out of pure feeling. So when your blood is withdrawn from the neocortex frontal part of your brain, you are no longer cognitive. It's now replaced with the limbic brain, which is only capable of feeling. Right? So blood is also withdrawn from the extremities of your arms and legs, as well as your front neocortex. It will be shunted to your heart and lungs where it's needed most. This again will create a knock-on of effects that we'll discuss. This in turn creates a loss of fine motor skill amongst one thing, with an array of effects that may be present, all of which we will cover now. All of these effects are triggered, first of all, by the recognition of a threat stimulus, which triggers the amygdala into escalating the heart rate. And it's from here you're going to get the following effects. So first of all, what is fear? Well, the dictionary definition, English dictionary, defines fear as an unpleasant emotional response triggered via the amygdala, caused by the anticipation or the awareness of sudden danger. So that is the stimulus that triggers the adrenal response. As you'll understand here, the effects of adrenaline are what you're feeling. That's a natural biochemistry, and it's important that you understand that's there for your survival. What the mistake occurs is when people who are unfamiliar with that adrenaline spike and what's going on mistake that feeling for fear. And that's when that feeling turns then to abject terror or panic and shutdown. But basically, fear is anticipation of an unknown outcome. I don't know what's going to happen, therefore I'm trepidation and I'm apprehensive. That would be to me what fear is, fear of the unknown. False evidence appearing real. Now, adrenaline, on the other hand, is the body's natural biochemistry. It's a chemical cocktail that is released as a response to severe stress, indicating possible danger. The hormones responsible are adrenaline, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. And this chemical cocktail combined can be used to your advantage as opposed to your disadvantage, as we'll see. So adrenal stress and effects on the body and brain function. The first thing that happens is an increased heart rate. Adrenaline has an immediate effect on the heart rate, accelerating the same, which in turn can have a detrimental effect on both the physiology and the cognitive decision-making process. So if you understand the analogy of Cooper's colour codes, if you're out and about and aware in condition yellow and everything is yonky-dory and cool, then your heart rate will be at resting beats, whatever that is for you, your age. If, however, all of a sudden you are alarmed to a potential threat coming in your direction, and you go from condition yellow, aware, to condition orange, alarmed, well, that means something's now coming to your immediate environment that indicates danger. And what will accompany that is a spike in your heart rate. As your heart rate increases, there's most likely going to be a sharp intake of breath, and now you hold your breath, and the derogatory effects of adrenaline that follow will be worse than they need to be. But the bottom line is, as soon as your heart rate escalates beyond 145 beats per minute, or even less in some individuals, blood is withdrawn from the frontal neocortex of the brain, and your ability to make a decision under stress is now severely impaired. When you switch to the limbic system brain, you are left with the intelligence of a dog. What you basically know is fight, flight, or freeze. So knowledge is power, and knowledge dispels myths. So the more you can get educated about what's actually going on, the more chance you've got of getting a handle of adrenaline under such conditions. So I'm going to give you these effects in a semi-chronological order. They're not necessarily going to happen in this way. You're not necessarily going to get them all, but I'm going to describe them all. First one is tunnel vision, also called positional dysphyxia. And the positive side of tunnel vision is it allows you to enhance your frontal concentration because your vision, peripheral scope will narrow and you have a laser focus on what's in front of you. The negative byproduct of this is it creates closure of the peripheral vision, which makes you very vulnerable to a flanked assault. And criminals know this. They know it on an innate level. That's why there's often a stimulus from the front, or you're attacked from the side or behind. One of the effects on you will be pale or pallid skin tone. This is due to blood leaving the surface of the skin better to be employed elsewhere. This is also nature's way of helping you out should you get cut, to allow you to congeal and clot faster. But the bottom line is, blood is withdrawn from the extremities to go to the heart and lungs where it's needed most, and this will leave you looking very pallid in complexion. And if you appear white, very white, gone all of a sudden bright white, you appear scared. So it sends a clear message, particularly if you are being accosted by a potentially violent criminal. Another thing that will happen is pre-fight shakes. So just before the event, when you realise adrenaline's hitting your body, your extremities will start to shake, and they can shake uncontrollably, arms and legs. This is where, again, the blood's leaving the extremities of the limbs to go to the heart and lungs. But the act of shaking, again, can portray fear to the person that you're facing. Loss of fine motor skill. So when blood leaves the extremities of the hands, which in turn create an impairment to any fine movement, motor skill requiring dexterity, hand-eye coordination. So what do I mean by that? So if you take something along the lines of Jeet Kune Do or Wing Chun or Silat, anything that involves tracking and complex motions or fine motor skill, then when blood is withdrawn from the extremities and the heart rate escalates, these kind of skills usually fall apart. On the positive side, gross motor skills, anything requiring a large motor movement action, a push, a rag, a pull, a throw, punch, strike, where you are using multi-muscle joints, multi-joints in unison with each other, large gross motor, are actually enhanced under the effects of adrenaline, because you will hit harder and you will hit faster. So the majority of your combative skills, if they are related against dealing with real violence in the street, and you are talking from an unarmed perspective, then they should be very simple and gross motor. Simple and gross motor is easier to install and easier to retain under fight duress. Another thing that can happen is voice quiver. So your voice may acquire an audible tremor. So again, when I said to you, you go from parasympathetic nervous system to sympathetic nervous system. But when that happens, your body shuts down functions that you don't momentarily need. And one of those is salivation, the ability to produce saliva. Because during this potentially critical life-threatening incident, you are not going to eat anytime soon. Therefore, you do not need digestion. So your vocal cords will dry out. How this can betray you is when you are forced to use your voice in an assertive sense, let's say, now your voice can acquire an audible tremor if you're not careful. In which case, again, it will betray you to the subject that you're facing. So I'm going to give you an example of several of those effects happening to one of my friends in the door environment after I finished this. But another effect of that with the audible tremor is dry mouth, often referred to as cotton mouth. This is, as I said, due to the salivary glands shutting down when the adrenal effect hits the body and you move into sympathetic nervous system. There is also a need to empty the bowels and the bladder, And the next one comes into this as well, which is nausea. So adrenaline may cause vomiting or the feeling of vomiting. This is nature's way of eliminating waste in order to move more efficiently under the fight or flight response. And that's the same reason you need to feel the need to evacuate your bowels or evacuate your bladder, so that you are more efficient and can move through time and space quicker. Another one is yellow fever. So yellow fever, adrenaline is certainly adrenal dump. So understand what I mean by that. So there is different degrees of intensity of adrenaline. So you could have an incident that you have to deal with tomorrow that you've got pre-intel about that will make you feel trepidation. You will get now slow release of adrenaline. Handleable, but you will get slow release. Over a period, depending on how many times you keep thinking about the same event, this can get really quite tiring. Pre-fight adrenaline can also be where somebody's walked into the room, they give you a cursory glance across from 20 feet, they're stood over there. This pre-adrenaline will now be much more intense. But the most intense of all is where there's no intel. Sudden stimuli, violence is required, or a violent action is coming your way, and you get this adrenal dump. This is much harder to control. The best way to control such a response is immediate action, so now you're using it. But usually this is where people will freeze or capitulate, and this has often been termed yellow fever. So it will bring on an extreme feeling of depression and foreboding. Now, what this is also known as is condition black. So Cooper's colour codes were condition white, switched off, condition yellow, alert and aware, condition orange, alarmed, condition red, the need for action now, fight or flight response. And then sometime later, the US Marine Corps added a condition black to it. And condition black, in the context of how they used it, simply meant all bets are off. And we're in this situation, it's a shit situation, odds are stacked against us, but fuck it. And that's the way they meant it. If you apply that to the living man and woman civilian type of self-protection market, then it has quite a different meaning. And condition black basically means that they've got into that sense of foreboding. It's become so stressful that the heart rate's gone way beyond 145, maybe 175 up to 200 beats, and now there's no emotional control whatsoever. This is the one at all costs you must strive to avoid. And what will allow you to avoid it most, first of all, comes from the education. Understanding what's going to happen. The reason somebody goes straight into a condition black is because they've got no understanding of what's going on, and no understanding of what we talked about so far. Now, this can easily be negated by your pre-fight perspective. So if you are a combative trainee, you should have a certain way of thinking about certain things anyway, and you should, crisis rehearsal in your brain and pre-think through how you would deal with said situation if it come your way. That would make you a much more efficient combative trainee. Now you are, in fact, reframing your perspective of the event, which means you're most likely to respond in a different way, more controlled. The final one that relates to an effect of adrenaline are really the positive ones. And the positive ones are increased strength and speed, in addition to becoming more anaesthetised to pain and shock. So not superbly, if somebody set you on fire, you'd fucking feel it. But if somebody broke your jaw in fight full of adrenaline, broke your nose or anything else and didn't knock you unconscious, you'd be able to ride the pain. I've had ribs broken in fight, I've had my nose broken in fight, and I didn't even feel it. All I felt was like white light. When I've been hit in the head during a situation on the door where people have hit me from behind as I'm trying to get to a colleague. It got, one particular club was so bad that I worked at, everybody put in a gum shield. So if there was a problem at the end, you put in a gum shield to get to your friend, because 3 or 4 people are going to try and punch you in the head. But because you're adrenalised in that moment, you just feel white light. Next day, you've got fucking lumps like the Elephant Man, and they hurt like fuck. But they do anaesthetise you to pain during the event, and shock to a degree. And like I said, they will make you stronger and faster. You'll hit as hard as you're ever going to hit, and you run as fast as you could ever run, as long as the motion is gross motor and not complex or fine motor skill. So these are the effects that you're likely to feel from the chemical cocktail of adrenaline when it hits your body, or what Bruce Siddler, who's an expert in this field, calls the SSR, the survival stress response. So you need to get familiar with it. So this part relates to knowing yourself. Knowing yourself, first of all, on those effects are going to be present in varying degrees of intensity. The other area of knowing yourself comes from self-awareness. So where do you stand right now in terms of your willingness to be able to deal with extreme violence? What is your understanding of that? And that's what's going to take us now just to this other part, which relates to knowing the enemy. So, understanding how there is a difference between a violent criminal and the average law-abiding man or woman. Okay, so of course there's variables attached, but I'm going to give you a general idea. So here are some factors that clearly define the difference between the vital criminal and the average person. Of course, there will be variables on both sides in differing degrees, but I'm going to keep to a general MO, or modus operandi. General pattern of behaviour, variables somewhere in the middle. So that you can get some idea of what we're talking about here in regards to knowing your enemy and knowing yourself. So first of all, let's look at some of the probabilities of a violent criminal. There'll be no moral boundaries. He doesn't understand moral compass. Knows that violence will get the desired result. Has been on the receiving end of violence many times and has dished it out many times before. May have come from a troubled upbringing. May have struggled with drug and alcohol addiction. May have some mental health issues. Has probably done some prison time. Has no regard or care for law and order. And has no regard for human life. Now understand I'm talking generically here. There may be differences in that, but bad motherfucker is bad motherfucker, right? The primary experience of violence will come from violence, and that's the massive advantage that any street criminal has. You can train in all the Krav Maga you want, train in all the combative training that you want. You can do simulations and everything else, but there's no fucking substitute for real experience. And their experience of the event comes from the event. That gives them a massive advantage that you need to understand. We'll use an extreme level of violence without any hesitation whatsoever. The what the subject uses in a physical sense will be simple, brutal, and emotionally rooted. In other words, they'll attack you with hurt and hate. Preferred method of assault will always be an ambush, that is, you don't see it coming, hence the need for awareness and threat recognition. We'll also initiate violence via some kind of introductory dialogue. So if they can't ambush you because you're aware of them and there's a presence, there'd be some kind of introductory dialogue. It could be a deceptive use of language where they use a ruse, or it could be incidental use of language. I just don't know you, like a recognition ploy, or it could be something that is aggressive and designed to intimidate. So it starts with hard eye contact, cursory glance, followed by, what the fuck are you looking at? You got a fucking problem with me? This kind of thing, which is designed to make the average layman completely go into shock and capitulate. The average beta male that drinks too many soy lattes will freeze on the spot, look around to see if they're talking to somebody else, and then capitulate. Which is the intention of the introductory dialogue, if it's an aggressive sense. If it's deceptive, it's designed to misdirect you before they can assault. So understand the difference. The dynamic of violence employed will be asymmetrical, which means it'll be a one-sided beating. They won't slap you, punch you, and then stand back and look at the handiwork and wait for you to have your turn. As soon as they attack you, they keep attacking you until you're a shit smear on the pavement. They use the principle of blitzkrieg, which is an offensive campaign designed to totally overwhelm the enemy before there's any chance of recovery or retaliation. So that's an asymmetrical model for violence, a one-sided beating. It's me, more of me, finished. It's not my turn, your turn. And that principle for prevailing in conflict comes from criminality and it comes from war. That's why the fuck we use it. So you need to know it. Understand also that a weapon is highly probable, and more than one subject will also be highly probable, right? Because they want highest probability of success. And what's going to give them that is a disparity. So if you're on your own and I've got a weapon, great. If I've got a mate and a weapon, even better. And now the threat's changing. Now you're looking at the potential of multiple armed assailants. So it doesn't get any fucking worse than that. So whether this is just a jihadi extremist looking for a magic carpet ride to fucking paradise, a crackhead looking for his next fix, a child molester or a rapist looking for the next victim, or the next gang member looking to expand his reputation, or maybe some sick, twisted fuck that simply enjoys inflicting harm on others. The primary commonality will be an instant willingness to inflict a savage level of violence on another human being without any hesitation, thought, or doubt. Now, compare that to the average law-abiding man or woman. The average law-abiding man or woman, and again, variables across the board. Some of these things may not be present. But usually, moral boundaries will be likely. A moral compass is in place. Potentially comes from a good upbringing, taught a code of conduct, ethics. Modern man in particular has often become quite effeminate, having been socially conditioned to become beta male status as opposed to the more alpha old school hunter-gatherer type. Too many soy lattes is an impaired and already low on the charts level of testosterone. Probably has absolutely no experience with real violence whatsoever, you can take that as a given, and has no expectation at all of just how brutal immediate violence will be. Will abide by the law and will be mentally hindered by any potential legal consequences. This will create even more hesitation to act. Would probably never have even considered having to deal with real violence in their life. Will struggle contemplating having to deal with any form of confrontation initially. Will be fearful of getting hurt to the potential point of total capitulation. There are several more, but we get the understanding that there will initially be a significant disparity, both on a physical and emotional level, in terms of the average good man or woman's willingness and readiness to engage in extreme violence compared to that of the criminal. As said, there may be variables out there that contradict this assessment, but you get the idea. So the first part of this introduction, if you like, to PSY COM, was to give you an understanding into knowing yourself and understanding the potential enemy. I'm going to elaborate on that somewhat further in the next part. For now, have a little look, research. Some people I recommend that you look at. Bruce Siddle, Sharpening the Warrior's Edge. Really good resource relating to controlling your emotional stress under combat stress. Also, On Combat, On Killing, by Grossman, who again is considered one of the leading authorities on enhanced performance under combat stress. But knowledge is power. Knowledge dispels myth. Understand that there's a difference between fear and the actual biochemistry of adrenaline. Understand what's happening to you. You'll also understand that there's an importance in your training to simulate that adrenal response and those kind of conditions in a training environment rather than keeping it sterile. It's important that you try and trigger the student into that mid-brain emotional state during scenario work, as I'll talk about more in depth later. But for now, these are some of the effects of adrenaline that we'll have on the body. I suggest you research further for further education. And these are some of the elements that relate to the predatory profile of a street criminal. Right, I'll just give you a quick previous example of a situation that depicts one of my friends and my colleagues at the time having a cluster of those side effects of adrenaline that we were talking about. And it was in a door-setting environment. So we were working in this place called the Ab Shot, and it was a rough sort of social club that had a lot of travellers and pikeys there. And previously there'd been a big scrap that was out in the car park and all sorts. And they were coming back for some, payback, whatever else. And I'm working on this night. It's about 4 or 5 man door team. And my friend Ian, who I was working with, strong lad, good lad, great reputation on the doors, had a stomach bug. So we had the shits. And we were in this situation where they were getting out and coming to the door, and we had to sort of stand and make sure they didn't get in, like a good filter system, and certain interactive dialogue occurred. Nothing major happened after this, but the interactive dialogue was interesting. And at one point it escalated, and my colleague Ian created a physical and a verbal boundary. And what he intended to say was, "Stay back, stay where you are." And because the effects of adrenaline hit him hard, his salivary glands dried up and he went completely high pitched and ended up like, stay back, like this, which of course these three pikeys are now fucking stood back laughing. Well, these three pikeys didn't suddenly say to him, oh, you've got the physiological effects of adrenaline because you've gone sympathetic nervous system and your salivary glands have dried out and now you've gone high pitched and got an audible tremor. They didn't say that. They simply said, you're scared. Because that's what it depicts and that's how it depraves you. It can put you over as. If also you have the shits and you hadn't sorted yourself out maybe before you come on shift, you could also find a problem when you get the bowel release or the need to release your bowel. So it was really, really funny. He actually managed to posture and get his voice back, and various other things happened that created a disconnection and no more further problem. But he got the high-pitched voice tone. He went really quite pale, pallid white, and his bowels nearly evacuated as he used his voice. And he said to me, Lee, I've shit myself. It was really quite funny. But it's the effects of adrenaline. I mean, he kind of beat himself up about it afterwards. He's thinking, fucking hell, I've been doing this stuff for years. And I said, well, you should know that these are the effects. You know, if you have a problem on a Friday night and you know it's coming back on a Saturday night, guarantee you before shift, every doorman is in the toilet taking the longest piss ever. So, you know, these effects are the natural physiological response of adrenaline. It's important that you understand them. So back in the day of Jeff Thompson and legends like John Anderson, they understand the leg shake, and quite often Jeff Thompson would talk about how he would tap his foot to the beat of the music inside the club in order to disguise it. Now, the key to controlling adrenaline, really, or controlling the heart rate at least, would be to get the heart rate down. So if you could, pre-event, take in a large number of breaths till you've got your heart rate down and you become calm, then in theory you would bring your heart rate down to a normal level so you could remain cognitive and not suffer the effects of adrenaline. However, if a situation is just about to kick off imminently, you can't stop and do fucking Tai Chi. So many of the doormen back in those days during the 90s would smoke cigarettes, and John Anderson is a legend in this business of reality-based self-protection, but also legendary as a doorman, would smoke a cigarette, and he'd be on the door smoking his cigarette. One would be up in his face, and he would take a large deep inhalation of the cigarette. Of course, not recommended, but that's what he would do. And then he would blow it at the subject in defiance, if you like, which showed him clearly that he was willing, and would then give him a loophole or a choice if he wanted to push it any further. But the actual action of him taking in that large inhalation and breathing out allowed him to keep his heart rate on an even keel. So things like this are, little tips that you start to learn as you become more exposed and experienced to it. And the thing that you'll find is if you work in a potentially hostile, confrontational environment, so military, security, a doorman, something like that, or a fireman where you're facing danger most days, then you'll be very, very familiar with the adrenaline, in which case the more exposure to it you get, the more desensitized you get, which can have a detrimental effect if you become too complacent. But you get very familiar with what you get used to. But for the average guy working in IT that's never had so much as a row with his wife, and not really a confrontational type of person who's maybe just started self-protection type skills for the first time, he's not going to have that advantage, in which case you would need to move into the realms of simulation and scenario training that will allow you to replicate to a degree varying levels of those effects.